At this point, all I can say is, God, I hope Rebel Moon ends up being good.
It wasn't.
Zack Snyder is a filmmaker so divisive his name can start an argument on the level of the action scenes he directs. Personally, I consider myself a fan of his work, but I also approach every new movie he releases with the mindset of, God, I hope this is one of the good ones. That was especially the case with the release of his most recent movies, the two-part epic space opera, Rebel Moon. I remember when the trailers for this movie were coming out, I tried to be as optimistic as I could, but I couldn't help but feel like it just kind of looked like a generic sci-fi movie with barely enough interesting material for a 3-minute ad, let alone a 4-hour saga. That and the fact that Snyder was pitching this as his new long-term franchise, which, you know, has always worked out so well in the past. Still, as I do with every new Snyder movie, I checked both of them out, and despite trying to find the good in it, the only thing I took away is that he doesn't seem to have learned anything from his past mistakes. But before we get into that, if you like this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1.50 a month, you'll get access to all my videos before they get released on YouTube. And you'll also get a shout out at the end of every video. Let's begin by talking about Part 1, A Child of Fire. The plot follows a former soldier named Korra from an intergalactic dictatorship known as the Motherworld, who went into hiding years ago in a tiny farming village on a distant moon. Despite thinking herself safe there, Korra one day finds the village threatened by the Motherworld's military known as the Imperium.
We're gonna have to fight.
With the clock ticking, Korra and a fellow villager named Gunnar venture across the galaxy, recruiting warriors to mount a defense against the Imperium and protect their village. So, you know how in Batman v Superman, the conflict that the movie was actually named after often took a backseat to teasing future movies that, let's face it, are never coming out?
You're right about him! You've always been right about him! Fear him!
Oh, shit.
Well, it seems that Zack Snyder looked at that approach to long-term storytelling and thought that his real problem was he wasn't doing that nearly enough. Right from the first act of Rebel Moon, instead of the movie focusing on establishing the characters' personalities, making us care about them, and making us fear for them as an entire army is coming to wipe them out, the film instead sidelines all of that to lecture us about the Motherworld and their war on the rest of the galaxy. And look, if that's what you want to make your story about, that's perfectly fine, but you can't expect it to work when it's being tacked onto a story that is tangentially related at best. There are a lot of world-building scenes early on, but since the story we're watching isn't actually about that, the lore usually just takes the form of a lifeless plot synopsis rather than a story with emotion and character that we actually get to see play out.
On the Motherworld, 1,000 kings ruled unchallenged in succession. In myth, she was called the Chalice, or the Redeemer.
The Motherworld's forces were commanded by a young general named Belisarius. The princess was named after an ancient queen, Issa.
On top of this just being the most unengaging and forced ways of conveying a story imaginable, the really annoying thing about this exposition is that it doesn't play to Snyder's strengths as a director at all. Snyder is iconically a very visual storyteller. So many of his best scenes throughout his career have been things like action scenes or montages, scenes that are primarily told through visuals with little to no dialogue. Here though, most of the movie is told through extremely bland monologues with no atmosphere or suspense or feeling put into them. To be fair, some of these monologues are told alongside flashbacks, which are visually quite nice, but they're impaired by the fact that the movie seems more concerned with telling us the theoretically interesting parts rather than letting us see them for ourselves. Like this scene where Korra talks about how the Imperium slaughtered her home as a child. It's a tragic story, but we barely get to see any of it beyond the deaths of a few people we have no context for, because Snyder seems to think it will suffice to just have Korra say it happened in the most cold and matter-of-fact way possible.
The people of my world had mounted a brave defense.
But who is this exactly?
The movie eventually does try to buckle down and focus on the story at hand, once the characters start going on their journey of recruiting warriors to fight with them. But it's only then that you realize what absolute nothingness the story is. The actual main plot of Part 1 is Korra and Gunnar going from place to place and picking up fighters for their cause. That's about it. It's not that the movie doesn't have any conflict during all of this, but none that last any longer than a few minutes. At more or less every stop, the characters they recruit get briefly introduced. That character has a problem they need to resolve that a lot of times don't even tie into the main plot at all, and again aren't established in any meaningful detail. Then they tag along, and that's the extent of their character development for the rest of the movie. And the sad thing is that a lot of these characters and their conflicts could be interesting, like an enslaved animal tamer who uses his talents to earn his freedom, a swordswoman who protects a small colony from this spider alien with a traumatic past, or this group of rebels against the Mother World. But the movie just skims through all of them, keeping them as vague as possible and giving us nothing to emotionally latch onto. The worst part is that because all of these scenes are primarily focused on introducing these side characters, the plot gets very little chance to flesh out Cora and Gunnar, who are supposed to be the main leads. The most they'll usually do is incredibly minor help in the background of an action scene or give an extremely half-hearted speech.
To give you a chance at redemption.
I am beyond redemption.
If not redemption, what about revenge?
The best way I can describe Rebel Moon Part 1 is that it feels less like an actual story and more like a 2-hour trailer for several different movies all at once. 1 minute it's about farmers standing up to a dictatorship, the next it's about the Motherworld's conquest and political powers, the next it's about one of the many side characters in their lives. By the end of it, nothing has been properly developed, and it makes it really hard to care about anything that's coming next. I'm writing this part of the script the day before the release of Part 2, and considering how much Part 1 failed to make me interested in the characters or the world building in this universe, I can't exactly say I'm thrilled to see more of it. Although, with that said, I'm hoping that I'm wrong and that Zack can maybe pull a DCEU on us. Like, sure, Batman v Superman was terrible, but at least it led to a good movie later on. Way later on, but it happened. Plus, with all the complaining I've done about Part 1 being overly focused on setting up a sequel, maybe now that we're actually at that point, the plot might get explored in a bit more detail, or the characters might get a bit more development. It's even worse. So, about what I said regarding Part 1 and how a lot of the storylines just felt like setup for the sequel, well, if that's the case, it sure as hell isn't this one. Part 2, subtitled The Scar Giver, somehow manages to have even less of a story than the first one. What little plot we have involves the heroes returning to the village and preparing for a battle with the Imperium. All the while, Cora and Gunnar are now in a romantic relationship, despite the fact that in the first film they had so little chemistry or even direct interaction that I genuinely forgot it was a plot point until they said it outright near the end.
I know you're in love with her.
The first half of Part 2 involves the village preparing for the Imperium's invasion, and overall has a much slower pace and smaller scale compared to the first movie. That would be fine, but the movie just doesn't have anything worthwhile to justify it. There's no character development throughout most of it, or debate between the villagers about how best to prepare for the attack, or anything that would warrant taking up half the fucking movie for. There's one scene where they attempt to develop the characters a little bit. On the night before the attack, the heroes all sit around a table and talk about their backstories, each with their own Snyder-stylized flashback scenes. You'd think this would be more along the lines of what I'm looking for, but much like the first film, the potentially interesting parts of their backstories are all told through exposition. Visually, all we get are the very ends of the stories, with the actual emotional weight being glossed over.
The Regent Belisarius has sent me and my ship as a show of force, so the choice of whether or not to vote for independence from the realm would be obvious. I was ordered to open fire on the capital. I refused.
And it's not even that you can't tell a good story through dialogue, but the exposition given is more concerned with stating what their tragedies are objectively, and not why any of it matters to them or what they've lost on an emotional level. Then we get to the second half where the Imperium attack the village, and at this point, the rest of the movie essentially just becomes one long action scene. You might think that the movie would become at least a tiny bit more interesting, considering it's at least more eventful than the empty void that was the first half. But to go back to my point about how Rebel Moon is a really bad showcase of Snyder's talents, the action scenes are not that good in either of these movies. They're okay, but the choreography, set pieces, and even directing aren't anything special. The cinematography is honestly pretty standard and unremarkable for Snyder standards, and his use of slow-mo is just used frivolously on random attacks instead of saving them for the more impactful moments of a fight like he usually does. So instead of the slow-mo allowing us to savor the moments that really matter, they just make the action feel slower and less exciting. And in the case of Part 2's climax, the actual plot is just as non-existent as it was in the first half, it's just louder than it was before. There are some occasionally interesting moments, like when Korra contemplates surrendering herself to save the village, or when she and Gunnar infiltrate the Imperium ship disguised as soldiers. But outside of that, you're mainly just spending a full hour watching characters you barely know and don't care about running around and shooting each other. I couldn't care less who lives or dies because it doesn't make a difference. The characters are so poorly developed and inconsequential that you could very easily just swap most of the death scenes for any other character and it would be just as meaningless. And while I'm pointing out how badly structured this story is, I really have to question why Rebel Moon needed to be a two-parter. Considering how the first film is really just a bunch of easily disposable mini-adventures, and especially the sheer amount of nothing that happens in the second, I feel like this could have very feasibly been one movie, about 2.5 hours long at the most. And as far as I'm concerned anyway, and again, this is coming from someone who is genuinely a fan of his work, these are the two worst Snyder films. Batman v Superman was bad, but at least it had some strong atmosphere and action scenes that gave it some enjoyable moments. Justice League was bad, but at least that one wasn't his fault, and the version he actually made was good. And Sucker Punch was bad, but at least it actually wasn't and is actually a really good movie. No, I'm not joking. Rebel Moon doesn't have any of these luxuries. It's an unfocused and half-baked story that represents all of Snyder's shortcomings with none of the redeeming parts. I will be very surprised if this, of all of his franchises, ends up being the one that takes off. Still, he's welcome to try. And I'd love it if Part 3 comes out and is actually really good, but this franchise has given me no reason to think that'll be the case. That clip of Andrew Garfield from The Social Network at the beginning, by the way, that was meant to be in my Legend of the Guardians video, but I ran out of time to get the social media clip and put it in before I had to upload the video, so you're getting it now.